We've been getting hit with a major heat wave in my town recently, and it's sweltering in the shop right now. Now, I don't have AC in this shop, nor am I planning to put any in anytime soon. What I do have is a set of windows over here and a set over here by the miter station. And on a good day, those can give a nice cross breeze, but I'm really hoping we can amp things up a little bit with the installation of a shop fan.
First off, have you seen the price of buying a fan assembly like this? Ridiculous. And I know we can do it cheaper, because I'm going to be honest here, this is not the first time that I've built a swivel ceiling mount for a box fan like this. I actually built one years ago at our first home that you might have seen in the corner of some of our first build videos. But there are a few improvements over that design I'm hoping to make on this one. I went with a different brand of box fan this time. The one I used back then didn't last long, so I decided to try a different brand. I mention this because not all box fans are the same size, so the one you choose might become the one you're stuck with. I'm not sponsored by this fan brand in any way. It's just the one I picked after looking at a few different ones online. It should be widely available, and I'll put a link in the description in case you are trying to build my setup exactly using the plans we have designed. I also went with a black fan, as I personally think it looks cleaner and matches the tops of my workbenches. However, this meant that the cheap pine wood I was using for this build was going to either stick out like a sore thumb, or I needed to do something to make it look different. If you've been watching our recent videos, you might have seen me char our beginner workbench. I decided to do the same thing here, but really amp things up to 11 and get the wood a much darker black. I could have just painted the pieces black, but that would have required buying paint supplies. And so this seemed like the more cost-effective approach, since I already had everything. Next came cutting down the materials for this build. If you want to follow my build exactly, I went ahead and made plans for this design available with a precise cut list and materials. For the fan box frame, I used a 1x6, cutting the pieces at a mitered 45-degree angle that I thought would look nice to reinforce later on with some splines. Hence, our recent spline jig build video. The box fan I got comes with built-in rotatable feet, and rather than try to figure a way to remove them without taking apart the whole fan, I decided to incorporate them into the design as another means to help keep the fan in place in the frame. To this end, the top piece of my frame got an 1.25" Dado channel routed out. Yep, you heard that right. The top piece got the Dado slot for the feet of the fan, but we'll get into that more later. To make this fan able to tilt up and down, I needed to add rotation points in both of the sides. I marked the exact center of each side piece and drilled out holes to allow a 3/8 carriage bolt to pass through from the inside out. I used a Forstner bit and a hammer to recess the bolt heads into the boards so that it would not interfere with the fitment of the sides around the fan, and so that the square flange of the base of the bolt head would lock into the wood of the sides and not be able to rotate. I then went to assembling the pieces of my box frame. I laid everything face down and temporarily clamped the top and bottom pieces of the frame around the fan as a second set of hands. I want the front of the fan to be flush with the front of this frame, leaving a bit of a gap on the backside. This is another thing that we'll get into later on in the build as why I chose to do it. For now, I just use wood glue and pin nails to hold the pieces together, making sure to keep my pin nails close to the edges because, as I mentioned before, I'm going to come back and add some splines to each of these joints to reinforce them and add some character. To add some contrasting depth to this whole build, the middle section of the swivel mount consists of 3 pieces made from 1x4s instead of 1x6s. I marked and drilled out the holes for the 2 side-mounted carriage bolts we already put in, as well as repeated the process for a 3rd carriage bolt in the center of the top to allow this whole assembly to swivel 360 degrees independent of the tilting. If you are enjoying this build, don't forget to like, comment, or subscribe to our channel as it really helps us out. I glued and nailed one side of the top of the middle section of our mount together. I only attached one side for now, as I needed to attach the second side once it was in place so that I could slide both sides onto the carriage bolts of the lower frame before gluing it all together. When the first set of miter joints were fully cured, and I had finished building this handy spline jig, I went back to the box frame and cut slots for 2 half-inch splines in each of the joints. I filled them in with some half-inch square dowels I had and left them to dry. Once they were set, I came back with my flush trim saw and quickly cut off the excess. I definitely liked the result, and this little shop build was the perfect chance to give it a test run before incorporating it into something fancier. When the first joint of my middle section was cured, I clamped it up to my bench and repeated the same spline process. Next came assembling the middle and lower sections of the mount together. Now you could just slap the middle piece around the lower portion, but in learning from issues from my first design years ago, I found that the set of boards rubbing against each other does not offer much friction between the faces. And at sharper tilt angles, the fan wants to go with gravity and rotate all the way down. To combat this, I'm inserting external star lock washers onto each of the carriage bolts, in between the two pieces of wood. The teeth of the lock washer should bite into the wood when tightened down and give it just that little bit of extra friction to prevent unintended rotation. I also went ahead and purchased some comfortable star knobs that make tightening and loosening this assembly a breeze whenever I want to adjust the tilt or rotation. I glued and pin nailed the remaining middle section joint and then waited for that to set up before coming back to add in the splines. While all that was drying, I moved on to the final portion of this assembly, the top ceiling mount. Now this is just another rectangular box made from 4 cuts of 1x6 material. However, unlike the other sections of this assembly, I skipped the mitered corners and splines and went for a more traditional butt joint that I inserted dowels in to strengthen. The main reason I went with the different approach here is that I knew that I was going to be mounting part of this assembly to the ceiling before adding in the final piece, and I didn't think trying to route splines upside down while standing on top of a ladder would be a success story. So dowels offered a structurally strong alternative that would be easier to manage in that position. Now there's a lot of different stud finders out there. Some work, some don't. But what I found is the best is really just a strong magnet. Now they do make some magnetic stud finders that are just for this task, but I just use magnets myself. So we already know that on one side of this outlet, there has to be a ceiling joist because that's where outlets get mounted to. But if we use the magnet, we can latch right onto a screw that's mounting this drywall and see that the joist runs on this side. But just to be certain, and there we have 2 screws, so our joist is running just that way. And we can measure off the wall and see we're at just over 20 inches, and then we can mount our mounting piece right up there. To mount this assembly, I marked and drilled 2 holes in our top piece for lag screws to be inserted through the board and into the ceiling joist. I then marked a line on the ceiling where the joist was, and using the holes in my board as a guide, I positioned the board and marked where I needed to drill holes into the ceiling. After pre-drilling the holes, I attached the piece, tightening down the lag screws with a socket wrench. Now these screws and the ease of getting to them with the socket wrench was the main reason I did not want to attach the final piece of this upper section until it was mounted onto the ceiling. For the final piece of the upper mount, I drilled a single hole in the center that would serve as the attachment and rotation point for the middle assembly. I then used a clamp to hold it in place on the ceiling mount while I glued and inserted the dowels. Then jumped back over to the other sections while I left those joints to dry. Now, the Dado slot for the feet provides some containment for the box fan, but you can still remove the fan if you need to, which I think is a good reliability feature. But I wanted to make sure that there was no way the fan would fall out unintentionally. To ensure this, I used some of the remaining 1x6 I had left to cut 4 triangles to position in the front corners of the fan assembly. I glued and nailed these pieces in place, ensuring that I could still access the fan speed controls if I wanted to. I mentioned earlier that we were leaving a gap in the backside of the fan, so I went ahead and screwed in a couple of angle mounts to hold the fan in place from the back. Now, if I ever need to remove or replace the fan, I just need to unscrew these mounts. The reason for this gap I left in the backside is if I ever want to add in an air filter to help keep some of the dust out of the air in the shop, I can just flip these angle brackets around and slide in a standard 20x20 filter. I jumped back over to the ceiling mount to give a quick char on the exposed edges before going back and flush trimming the excess dowels. it was finally time to mount my fan. There are two reasons I put the fan upside down in this frame. The first, and most important, is that it moves the speed control knob to the bottom, so it is easier to reach if I ever want to change the speed. The second, and similar reason, is that it puts the cord for the fan at the top, so I don't have to run it as far, and I can keep it tacked up out of the way on the mount and the ceiling of my workshop.
Now it's been a couple weeks since we installed this shop fan, and I have to say it's made a considerable difference. On days when there's a nice little cross breeze, I can open up both windows, turn on the fan, and it really cools down this place quickly. I've also noticed that if I'm getting a lot of dust up in the air in here and it's getting stagnant, I can open up the garage door, turn on the fan, and this clears it all right out, which is amazing for someone like me that doesn't have dust collection set up in here. And I just want to thank you for staying with us as we did this build, and we wish you the best as you pursue your own craft.